In the fall of 2002, a 19-year-old woman named Gemma Houghton was just starting a brand new chapter of her life. She had just moved into her dorm room at the prestigious University of Manchester in England to begin her freshman year. Like a lot of new students, her first couple of months at the university were pretty quiet and uneventful. She was really there to learn, so she spent almost all of her time with her head in the books, focusing on her studies. Because of this, she hadn't really gone out of her way to meet new people or make a lot of new friends. She was finding her footing, getting used to a new place and a new routine. But then, in early 2003, about halfway through her first year, everything changed. One afternoon, she was standing just outside of her dorm building, probably just taking a break from studying, when a boy she had never seen before walked right up to her. He was tall, very handsome, and had this incredibly charming way about him. He just smiled and introduced himself. He said his name was Ian Redmond, and he was a senior at the school. And as it turned out, he actually lived in the very same building that she did. He said he'd seen her around and just wanted to finally say hello. Now, Gemma wasn't actively looking for a boyfriend at the time. Her focus was on her education. But she couldn't deny that she was immediately attracted to Ian. There was just something about him. And Ian would later say that the feeling was completely mutual. From his perspective, the moment he saw her, he knew he had to talk to her. This one single chance encounter, a simple hello outside of a dorm, would end up blossoming into a full-fledged romantic relationship. They started spending more and more time together. They would study in the library, grab coffee between classes, and just walk around the campus talking for hours. They were a perfect match. He was a bit older and more experienced with university life, and he helped her navigate her freshman year. She brought a fresh energy and a quiet determination that he really admired. Their relationship was one of those easy, natural ones that just felt right from the very beginning. And so their love story continued well after they both left the University of Manchester. They were inseparable. 6 years after that first meeting, on Christmas Eve of 2009, Ian asked Gemma to marry him. She, of course, said yes. It was a moment they had both been dreaming of. That very same year they got engaged, the couple reached another huge milestone. For years and years, both Ian and Gemma had been incredibly diligent about saving their money. They weren't big spenders, they were focused on building a future together. They were able to pool all of their savings and buy a house together. It wasn't a brand new glamorous house. In fact, it was a fairly beat-up cottage in a small, quiet town in England. It needed a lot of work. The paint was peeling, the floors were creaky, and the garden was overgrown. But Ian and Gemma didn't see it as a run-down house. They saw it as a canvas. They were actually very excited to do all the work themselves. They looked at this as an amazing opportunity to make the house exactly the way they wanted it, to pour their own personalities into every wall and every floorboard. More than that, it was a chance for them to spend quality time together, working as a team towards a shared goal. So, for the next 2 years, during all of their free time, on weekends and evenings after their regular jobs, Ian and Gemma would work on their home. They learned how to do plumbing, they put up drywall, they painted and sanded and gardened. It was hard, exhausting work, but they did it all together, laughing and learning along the way. They turned this dilapidated cottage into their own personal sanctuary. Then, finally, in August of 2011, right before their actual wedding day, they finished the last of the renovations. Their home was finally done. It was perfect. And so, they got married. Literally, right after their wedding reception, instead of heading straight to an airport for a honeymoon, they just moved right into their dream home that night. Their first night as a married couple was spent in the house they had built together. For the next couple of days, the newlyweds just got to enjoy being husband and wife for the very first time, all within the walls of their perfect home. It was a blissful, peaceful time. But the celebration wasn't over yet. It was time for their honeymoon. In addition to saving up for the down payment on their home, the couple had also set aside money specifically for a honeymoon. They wanted it to be an incredible, once-in-a-lifetime vacation, the surreal reward for all their years of hard work. After a lot of thought, they decided to go to Seychelles. It's this beautiful island nation in the Indian Ocean, a place that many people say has the most beautiful beaches in the entire world. It was the perfect escape. So on August 10th, the couple hopped on a plane and flew to Seychelles. When they landed, they checked into their resort, and it was unbelievable. It was this incredible place that overlooked a perfect beach with brilliant white sand and crystal clear turquoise waters. It was like something out of a postcard. After getting checked in and dropping off their bags, the couple went down to a restaurant right by the ocean. They were having a bite to eat, just sitting there listening to the waves, and they were probably thinking to themselves, this is it. This is going to be the best vacation ever. During the first week of their trip, the couple was very active. They were full of energy and wanted to see everything. They spent their days exploring the island, going out on different excursions like boat trips and hiking. They tried lots of different local restaurants. They were just all over the place, soaking in every moment of their honeymoon. And so, come Tuesday, August 16th, which marked the start of their second and final week, the couple was feeling a little bit tired from all that activity. They decided that today they would just have a lazy, relaxing day at the beach. No plans, no schedule, just sun and sand. So that morning, the couple grabbed their swimsuits, their towels, and a couple of beach chairs. They left the resort and headed down to the beach that was right outside their door. After finding a decent spot on the sand, they set up their chairs and towels and put their things down. Gemma laid down on one of the chairs to begin sunbathing, just ready to relax and read a book. Ian, on the other hand, was excited to get in the water. He grabbed his fins and his snorkel, leaned over and kissed Gemma on the cheek, and said he was going to go for a swim. Gemma remembers watching Ian as he walked across the beach toward the water. She watched as he stopped right at the edge of the waves and started to put on his big flippers and adjust his snorkel mask. She remembers just smiling to herself as he did that classic awkward flipper walk into the water. It was a funny, endearing sight. And as she watched him wade out into the ocean, she just thought to herself how incredibly lucky she was to be married to such an amazing guy. She really, truly loved him so much. After Ian had finally gotten into the water and had begun his snorkeling journey exploring the clear waters, Gemma laid back in her chair. The sun was warm, the sound of the gentle waves was soothing, and she began to doze off to sleep. A little while later, though, Gemma suddenly woke up. She was startled by a sound. It almost sounded like someone sneezing, but really, really loudly. It was a sharp, strange noise that cut through the peaceful atmosphere of the beach. Instinctively, she sat up and scanned the waterline, looking for her husband. But all she saw were other tourists in the water, swimming and snorkeling and just having a good time. She couldn't see Ian anywhere among them. And then she heard it. A male voice was calling out for help. It was coming from off to her right, towards the top of the beach, but pretty far away from her. She turned, her heart starting to pound, and she saw him. It was Ian. He was about 60 feet away from the sand, so he was well out into the water. He appeared to be kind of hunched forward, with one of his arms sort of submerged in the water, and he was waving his other arm frantically in the air. It looked like he was stuck on something, maybe caught on some rocks. But before Gemma could even get up or process what to do, before she could run to him or call for help, Ian just began to scream. It was a scream of pure agony and terror, a sound that no one on that beach would ever forget. When Ian began screaming, there was a surgeon who happened to be on vacation at this same beach. He was in a small boat nearby where Ian was. He heard the terrible screams and immediately motored his boat over to Ian. The surgeon and another man who was in the boat with him managed to pull Ian out of the water They got him onto the boat, and Ian was alive, he was conscious, but the sight was horrific. He was missing his entire left arm. He was missing the majority of his left thigh. And there was a huge chunk of his midsection that was just gone. It would turn out that Ian had been attacked by a bull shark, one of the most aggressive and dangerous shark species in the world. That strange, loud sneezing sound that Gemma had heard, the sound that had startled her awake, was the sound Ian had made through his snorkel at the exact moment the shark first bit down on him. The surgeon rushed Ian to the shore. He pulled him out of the boat and got him onto the sand and immediately began trying to save his life, applying pressure to the catastrophic wounds. At the same time, Gemma had come running up the beach. She managed to push her way through the crowd that was quickly forming around her husband. She dropped down to her knees on the sand right next to him. Ian, at this point, was still alive and he was still conscious. He was very, very badly hurt, but he was looking up and he was clearly making eye contact with Gemma. And Gemma, she was looking down at her husband, making clear eye contact right back with him. They didn't really say much. It was like this horrible, surreal moment where all they could do was just be there, together, in the final seconds of his life. And so, during this kind of silent, heartbreaking acknowledgement of their love and their tragic fate, Ian would ultimately pass away right there on the beach with his wife by his side. It would later turn out that over the past few weeks, there had been a rash of shark attacks at this very beach, including one other fatal attack on another tourist. Shark attacks in Seychelles were so incredibly rare, so unheard of, that authorities believed this had to be the work of one single rogue bull shark. They believed it was one shark that was responsible for all of these attacks. And because this shark had not yet been captured or killed, the country had actually instituted a temporary ban on swimming at this beach and a few other nearby beaches. But for whatever reason, the ban had not been communicated effectively to the tourists. The resorts hadn't made it clear. There were no prominent signs. And so, the ban was not being enforced. Gemma and Ian had absolutely no idea that the water was a dangerous place to be. They had just looked out, saw all the other tourists swimming and splashing around, and believed it was totally safe. When in reality, it obviously wasn't. Gemma would quickly return to England, her honeymoon and her life shattered. She would host her husband's funeral in the exact same church where she and he had been married, so full of hope and happiness just 10 days earlier. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee. It was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who travels to New York City. The film was a massive hit. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. After seeing the movie, with its stunning landscapes and charismatic hero, Ginger felt deeply inspired. She wanted to actually go to Australia to see the incredible country for herself because it just looked so amazing on the big screen. So, a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, traveling all by herself, hopped on a plane and flew to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. Her plan was simple and adventurous. She would land in Australia, work various odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. Then, at some point, whenever she felt like she was tired of doing that, she would just head back to the United States. She was young, independent, and ready for an adventure. She landed in Perth, and right away she saw her first opportunity to make some money. There had been a huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there. As a result, she saw all these beautiful luxury yachts anchored at the docks all along the coastline. Ginger thought to herself, you know, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who was very friendly and outgoing and not afraid to take a chance, went right down to one of these docks. She stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot vessel. She walked right up and introduced herself to the captain of the boat. She said, "Hey, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going? And in exchange, I'll work for you. I'll do whatever you need." As it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to help their chef in the galley. So he looked at her and said, "Okay, well, can you cook?" And Ginger confidently said, "Yeah, I'm a great cook." And he said, "Okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant." And just like that, Ginger's Australian adventure took an unexpected turn. She climbed on board and met the rest of the 5 other crew members. This included the head chef she'd be working with, a woman named Jane. The 2 of them would become very close friends during their time on the yacht. Shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next major stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly a 14-day journey away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were running dangerously low on fresh water. This was a serious problem in the middle of the ocean. So he decided to take a detour. He turned the yacht east and headed inland, navigating along a river system that he knew would eventually bring them to a large freshwater pool. He also knew that this pool had a huge, beautiful waterfall that dumped down into it. So he figured they could just take the yacht's small boat, go right underneath this waterfall, and fill up their jugs with all the fresh water they needed. Then they could head back out to the open sea, and they'd be good to go. So, on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the massive yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system. Then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which is a much smaller, more agile boat, into the water. Once that was ready, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew all hopped into this dinghy along with a bunch of large, empty water jugs. They began making their way from the ocean into the river. They traveled up this river for a little while, surrounded by the rugged Australian wilderness. And then, finally, they arrived at this huge freshwater pool. Right in front of them was the amazing waterfall the captain had described. Everybody was just totally awestruck by the sight of it. It was like a hidden gem in the middle of nowhere. They were in a very remote, very rugged part of Australia at this point, and to see something so beautiful was breathtaking. The captain brought the dinghy right up near the base of the waterfall. One by one, they held up their empty water jugs and filled them with the cool, fresh water. Once all the jugs were full, they were about to turn around and go back out to sea to get back on their yacht. But then the captain had an idea. He thought to himself, "You know what? We've been at sea for 7 days straight. It's been very monotonous, just the same routine day in and day out. Maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer. Maybe we could even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view, just enjoy the scenery for a bit before we head back out to sea." So he said to his crew, "Hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall?" And everyone agreed it was a great idea. It sounded like a fun little adventure. Everyone, that is, with the exception of Jane. She just didn't feel like hiking to the top of a waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool was basically surrounded on all sides by sheer cliff faces. There really wasn't any place to land the dinghy. There were no flat surfaces, no beach, nothing. You basically had cliffs that went directly into the water, and then you had the river that fed back out to the ocean. So the captain maneuvered the dinghy right up against the cliff face, right next to the waterfall. He, Ginger, and the other crew members, not including Jane, carefully climbed out of the dinghy and onto this cliff face. They began climbing, literally climbing up this steep rock wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it, except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the wet rocks. It was very steep, and it seemed kind of dangerous, and she wasn't an experienced climber. So at some point, she abandoned the idea and carefully made her way back down to the dinghy to wait with Jane. The captain and the rest of the crew, they continued their climb up towards the top. So as Ginger and Jane were sitting there in the dinghy, watching the other crew members making their way up the cliff, they started feeling a little bit left out. They were like, you know what? Let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall, an easier way. So they began scanning out across the pool, looking at the other cliffs that surrounded it. It looked like on the very other side of the pool, there was a less severe cliff face, one that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. So the two women, in a spontaneous decision, jumped into the murky brown water. They began swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. When they made it about a third of the way across, Jane suddenly stopped swimming. Ginger noticed and turned around in the water and looked at Jane. She was like, "What's going on?" And Jane would tell her, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger was so close to her goal. She was like, "Come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall." So Jane, she was totally hesitant, but she didn't want to let her friend down. She said, "Okay, fine." And they both continued to swim. And then all of a sudden, they heard their captain, who was now at the very top of the waterfall, screaming down to them. He was yelling to get out of the water right now. And they noticed he was pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. So they're looking up at him, confused, and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at. And that's when they saw it. There was this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It was a 12-foot-long saltwater crocodile that had noticed them in the water, and it was charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were way too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim back to it before this crocodile was going to reach them. So their next best choice was just to turn and swim as fast as they could towards the nearest cliff face. Because again, there was no place to get out of the water. There were only cliffs. So they swam frantically towards this cliff face, which was right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall. Water from the falls was landing on them as they reached the rocks. They were trying to climb up, trying to pull themselves out of the water, but there was nowhere to grab onto. The rock face was all totally slick with moss and water. There were no good handholds. All they had was this little ledge that was just under the water's surface that they could stand on, but they were still halfway in the water. After they struggled for a minute, desperately trying to pull themselves out of the water, and they realized they couldn't do it, they both just turned around. They locked arms, standing on that ledge together, and they looked out through the curtain of water that was falling down in front of them, out into the pool. And they saw this crocodile had followed them. It had now stopped, right on the other side of the falling water, and it was just staring at them with its mouth wide open, showing rows of sharp teeth. The two women are looking at it, frozen in terror. They don't know what to do. The captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down the cliff as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them. But it's going to take several minutes at least before they can get down to the dinghy and get over to them. Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this. They're alone. And they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away. At some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface of the murky water. But now, they don't know where it is. This uncertainty, this hidden threat, causes Ginger to completely panic. She let go of Jane's arm, and she dove into the water, off to the right. She was attempting to swim away from where the crocodile had been, trying to make a break for the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes. The crocodile suddenly re-emerged from directly underneath her. It grabbed her by the waist in its powerful jaws and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there on the ledge, watching all of this happen right in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy yet, so she's totally stranded. And she's just staring at the area of water where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. Just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile reemerges. Its head is pointed towards Jane. And in its jaws is Ginger. Ginger's got her arms up over her head. Her eyes are wide with terror, and she's looking right at Jane. Jane makes eye contact with her friend for one last horrific moment. But there was nothing she could do. She just watched as Ginger was again pulled back under the water. And this time, she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would finally get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, and they would pick her up. About 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would later turn out that the captain was well aware of the threat that crocodiles posed in this river. He had told his entire crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat. He had explicitly warned them that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, in a moment of carefree adventure, his warning went unheeded. In 2017, a man named Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit. From the time he was just a little kid, he had this sort of restless energy about him. He always needed to be out doing stuff. He could never just sit still. And so, by the time he was old enough, he left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon. There, he moved into a commune. A commune is a community of people that live together and share all their possessions and responsibilities. But shortly after moving into this commune, Aaron got restless again. This wasn't enough for him. And so he left the commune and began traveling all over the United States. But after he had basically gone everywhere in the country, seen all the sights, he became restless again. So he left the United States entirely. He went to Nepal and began traveling all over that country. And while he was there, he met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina. The two fell madly in love. And then, when it was time for Ladina to leave Nepal and go back to her home country, Aaron followed her. He moved to Switzerland to be with her. Just a couple of years later, in 2014, the pair got married. They bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. For a time, Aaron and Ladina were very happy. Their life was very simple and straightforward. They loved each other, and they loved living in Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust, that deep-seated need to explore, reared its head again. He went up to Ladina and he told her, honey, I need to go out and explore again. I need to go out and be free again. Even if it's just for a couple of days or a week or whatever time it is, I need it. He explained that he needed it in order to feel sane. I don't think Ladina was very pleased about this development. It's hard to hear that the person you love needs to leave to feel free. However, she knew her husband. She knew this was a core part of who he was, and she knew it was important to him and to his mental health. So she said, okay, honey, you do what you have to do. So Aaron thought about what he was going to do to satisfy this deep desire to go out and be free again. He settled on attending that year's Burning Man festival. It was something he had never done before, and it seemed like the ultimate expression of the freedom and community he was searching for. So Aaron left Switzerland and he went back to Oregon in the United States. He met up with a very close friend of his named Justin. Justin was actually someone he had lived with in the commune all those years ago. So the two of them, they linked up in Oregon, and from there, they drove in Justin's big van out to the Nevada desert. When they got to Nevada, they drove out to the Burning Man site. As they were pulling up, they saw thousands and thousands of other vans and tents and all these people out in the middle of the desert setting up and building this temporary community, this utopia. So right away, Aaron and Justin, they found their spot. They parked their van and they began to build their own campsite. And then after that, they pulled their bikes out of the van and began biking around, helping other people build their sites and build the rest of the community. So by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had already made lots of new friends. They were out partying and dancing and singing with total strangers, just completely immersed in the Burning Man experience. That night, Aaron would actually turn in early, while Justin would stay up and continue having a good time with the new people he had met. Aaron was just not a night owl. He liked to get a full night's sleep and then get up early in the morning, make himself a smoothie, and do yoga. This was very normal behavior for him. Justin would later say that he really looked up to Aaron. In fact, many people who knew Aaron looked up to him. Because Aaron, on the one hand, was a total free spirit that would just kind of go where the wind would blow him. But at the same time, he was very regimented and disciplined. He took great care of himself, both physically and mentally. He just seemed wise beyond his years. And he was incredibly charismatic and very funny, so people really flocked to him and really idolized him. One of the central traditions of Burning Man has to do with its namesake. Towards the end of every festival, they build this 40-foot-tall wooden effigy of a man, and they burn it to the ground. Hence the name, Burning Man. So on the night of the so-called man burn, Aaron told Justin that he was not going to turn in early that night. He said that instead, he was going to stay up and watch the spectacle of this effigy being burned to the ground. Justin was really excited about it, and so was Aaron. So that evening, Aaron and Justin met up with the new friends they had made while they were at Burning Man, and their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. Now, this huge structure was situated in a huge open clearing. And standing all around this wooden man were what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event who also have some fire training. They would stand almost shoulder to shoulder or very close to shoulder, facing away from the effigy, forming a human perimeter around it. The Rangers' job was to prevent the crowd of 70,000 people from getting too close to the effigy when it was on fire, because it's obviously a huge hazard. So Aaron, Justin, and their friends, when they got to this clearing and saw the effigy, they would have seen thousands and thousands of event attendees converging on this thing, getting as close to the Rangers as they possibly could on all sides. So Aaron and Justin and their friends, they made their way up to one particular section of this massive crowd, and they began fighting their way through all these people, trying to get as close to the Rangers as they possibly could, because they wanted a good view of the man burn. And then, once they were satisfied with their view, they just stopped and waited for the effigy to be lit. But just before the effigy was lit, Aaron turned to Justin and said, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, on the other side of the crowd. I'm going to go see them right now." Justin was totally bummed that Aaron was going to be leaving right before this thing was lit because he wanted to experience this moment with Aaron. But he said, "Okay, no problem. I'll see you. Hopefully, before this thing gets lit, or, I'll see you after this burn is done." And so Aaron departed from the group, and Justin watched as he kind of just disappeared into the dense crowd. Then Justin turned his attention back towards the effigy. A little while later, when the sun had gone down and it was totally dark out and the crowd was totally electric as they were waiting for this thing to light, finally they did. They lit the effigy. And as soon as it went up in flames, the crowd of thousands and thousands of people roared with excitement. This whole time, Justin is totally amazed by what he is watching, but he's also scanning the crowd, hoping that Aaron will eventually pop back up. But at this point, the crowd is so massive and everyone's so tightly packed together that Justin isn't really expecting Aaron to be able to make his way back over to where he had been. It just didn't seem possible. So this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames and everyone's so amazed by it. And then, eventually, the flames begin to dwindle down as the structure continues to burn, getting lower and lower to the ground. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begins to disperse. At this point, Justin again looks around, hoping to maybe see Aaron, but, Aaron has not come back yet. And so Justin just says, "Okay, maybe it's time to leave and go check in with Aaron back at the van." So he notifies his friends that he's going to turn around and head back. And as Justin turns and begins leaving the crowd, someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin, and they frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that had happened to Aaron. Now at first, Justin just could not believe it. He couldn't even process it. It seemed so outlandish and so unbelievable that it just could not have possibly happened. But then he was thinking to himself, I haven't seen Aaron since he left to go see his friends from Switzerland, and I have no idea where he is. And so Justin starts looking around the crowd again. He's not seeing Aaron, and he's starting to panic. And so finally, Justin just turns and starts running back towards his van in the desperate hope that Aaron is going to be there. But when he gets back to his van, Aaron is not there, and there's no sign that Aaron has been back since they had left for the man burn. It would turn out that that shocking story Justin had been told about Aaron was true. This is what really happened. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd and spend some time with his friends from Switzerland, he disappeared from the group. He made his way over to that far side of the crowd, but we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland or if that was just some cover story to get away from Justin and the other people he was with. But regardless, at some point, Aaron made his way over to the other side of the effigy, away from Justin and away from his other friends. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd until he was right in front of the Rangers with front row seats of the effigy. And then, after the effigy was set alight and was fully engulfed in flames, Aaron at some point bum rushed one of the Rangers who was standing right in front of him. He was able to push past him. And then, before that Ranger or any other nearby Rangers could stop him, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive, burning effigy. He ran right into the fire, and he disappeared inside of it. Because the crowd was massive and unruly, and many people were under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both, because of all that, even though Aaron ran into a blazing fire right in front of them, it was like nobody noticed. Everybody was in their own little world. It was dark out, there was this giant fire, there were so many distractions that really nobody noticed this happening besides the Rangers that were immediately affected by Aaron running past them, and some of the people that were right at the front of the crowd who watched as Aaron did this. And so this is why Justin and the rest of his friends had no idea this had happened, despite the fact they were watching this same fire as it was happening. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the Rangers were able to go in after him and pull him out. But by that time, it was already too late. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night from his injuries. It would later be determined that Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the burning man. This means he was of a clear mind when he decided to do this. And so it was determined that his death had to be a suicide. However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit suicide, especially like this. It just didn't make any sense. This is not something Aaron would have done. He was acting totally normally. His behavior was not erratic. Something else must have caused this to happen. But unfortunately, at this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so, to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the 18th of July 2019, a 28-year-old man named Andrew Harper carefully wrote a short note inside of a card. He folded it neatly, slid it into its envelope, and then handed it to a close friend who was standing nearby. With the envelope in hand and clear instructions from Andrew, the friend left the room and started walking down the long hallway. They were inside a place called the Ardington House, this beautiful historic mansion built way back in the 1700s. It sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parkland about an hour west of London, deep in the English countryside. Andrew's friend walked the length of the mansion, found the room he was looking for, and gave a gentle knock on the door. After being welcomed inside, he walked straight over to a 28-year-old woman named Lissy Beckett and handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same small town of Wallingford. It was a quiet, rural place about 10 miles away from where they were now at the Ardington house. They had met each other when they were just 15 years old, and from that moment on, they had been completely inseparable. It was one of those rare cases of true love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, after all that time, they were finally getting married. So, Lissy took the envelope from the friend. She instantly recognized Andrew's handwriting on the outside, and a smile spread across her face. She carefully opened the letter and read the simple message inside. It just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." Now, on the surface, this little note just seemed like a sweet, romantic gesture from a man to his fiancée on their wedding day. But in reality, those 7 words perfectly captured who Andrew Harper really was. He was a protector. For as long as Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been deeply concerned with her safety, and really the safety of anyone and everyone around him. He just had this innate need to make sure that people were taken care of. As Andrew grew older, he also grew bigger. He ended up being a massive 6 5" tall man, and this physical presence only amplified his natural instinct to protect others. He was known for being incredibly charming, friendly, and easy to talk to, but everyone who knew him also knew that in an instant he could flip a switch. He could use his big frame to step in and defend anybody who needed it, no questions asked. It was just who he was. So it came as no surprise to Lissy, or anyone else for that matter, when Andrew decided at the age of 19 to become a special constable. A special constable is basically a volunteer police officer. He joined the Thames Valley Police Department, which was the same department that looked after his and Lissy's hometown of Wallingford and all the surrounding areas. He was so good at it, so dedicated, that just 1 year later, the department hired him on full-time as a regular police constable. He was now a full-fledged police officer. Over the next several years, Andrew's work ethic and his genuine passion for the job made him one of the most well-respected and well-liked officers on the entire force. He wasn't just doing a job, he was living out his calling. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent that wedding day letter to Lissy, he had earned a major promotion. He was assigned to the Roads Policing Unit within the Thames Valley Police. This was a big deal. It meant a whole host of new responsibilities, but more importantly, it meant that Andrew would now be one of the first officers to respond to any emergency call that came in. He was on the front lines. Of course, this meant his job just became significantly more dangerous. He would be heading into unknown, high-stakes situations on a daily basis. But for Andrew, that didn't matter. The risk was secondary. To him, the most important thing in the world was protecting people who were in trouble. This promotion just gave him a bigger, better opportunity to do exactly that. So back at the Ardington house, Lissy read the note again. "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." She set it down on the table, a huge grin on her face, and finished getting ready. A little while later that afternoon, she and Andrew walked down the aisle. In front of all their family and their closest friends, they said, "I do." And that evening, after the newlyweds shared their first dance as a married couple, they both told each other, without a doubt, that this was the happiest day of their lives. They had their whole future ahead of them, a future they had been dreaming of since they were teenagers. 28 days later, on the night of the 15th of August, 2019, Andrew was on duty. He was partnered with another officer who, coincidentally, was also named Andrew. His partner's name was Andrew Shaw. The two of them were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading, which is about a 30-minute drive south of their hometown, Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., they decided it was finally time to wrap it up and head for home. Officially, their shift had ended 4 hours earlier at 7 p.m. But Andrew and his partner were the kind of dedicated, hard-working officers who regularly put in overtime. They knew the extra hours would help their unit and their cases, so they did it without complaint. But now, at 11 p.m., they were both totally exhausted. As they were yawning and packing up their gear, Shaw, who was in the driver's seat, started the engine of their unmarked BMW police car. Once it was running, he pulled away from the curb and they started heading north, back towards their home base. At that exact same time, not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been, a very distressed man was on the phone with 999, the UK's emergency number. He was telling the dispatcher that just a few moments earlier, a gray sedan had pulled up his long driveway and stopped right outside of his property. This man lived on a road called Admore Lane. It was a narrow, winding, one-lane country road with very little traffic, especially at night. There weren't many houses out there, so for any car to turn onto his property would have been unusual. For one to do it in the middle of the night was instantly alarming. As soon as the man saw the headlights creeping up his driveway, he had gone to his window to watch. He was trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe they were lost? Maybe they'd turned into the wrong driveway and would just turn around and leave. But to his horror, that's not what happened. The car stopped right outside his house. The doors opened and 3 masked men got out. They were all carrying what looked like weapons of some kind. At that point, the man frantically dialed 999. As he was trying to explain the terrifying situation to the dispatcher, he was still looking out the window and he suddenly realized what they were after. He told the dispatcher he thought they were there to steal his quad bike. The quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he could see the 3 men walking directly towards it. The dispatcher assured him that police were already on the way. But the man was getting more and more agitated. He told the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out there to confront them and stop them from taking my bike." The dispatcher immediately told him not to, yelling at him to stay in the house, reminding him that the men had weapons. But he wasn't listening. He ran to his front door and threw it open. By the time he was looking outside, though, it was too late. The gray car, the 3 masked men, they were all gone. And so was his quad bike. He went back inside and got back on the phone with the dispatcher, who told him again, "Just stay at your house. The police are on the way. They'll intercept that car and they'll get your quad bike back." Seconds later, a call went out over the police radio. It was a dispatch for all Thames Valley police units in the area. The call was to intercept a gray car on Admore Lane. The dispatcher advised that the occupants were 3 masked men, that they were armed and should be considered dangerous. When Andrew and Shaw heard this call, they knew a couple of things. First, they knew they weren't the only officers who could have taken it. There were other units closer, other units on duty. Second, they knew they had been off the clock for 4.5 hours. There was absolutely no expectation for them to respond. They could have, and probably should have, just continued driving home. But they didn't hesitate for a second. When that call came over the radio, the only thing they thought about was doing their job. So Shaw whipped the unmarked BMW around and sped towards Admore Lane. He turned off the main road, called the A4, and onto the narrow country lane heading north. As soon as they turned onto that road, their car effectively blocked the entire lane. There was no room for anyone to pass. At this point, they were fully expecting the gray car with the masked men to come driving towards them at any second. They were now the roadblock. Andrew and Shaw knew as soon as they turned onto that road that a close quarters confrontation was almost guaranteed. But if you listen to the dash cam footage from the front of their car, which picked up their voices, there's no hint of nerves. There's no fear, no hesitation in their conversation. They are calm, professional, and focused. This is what they had trained for. This is what they did. They were ready. So, Shaw is driving up this winding road. It's pitch black out. The trees on either side hang over the road, creating this dark tunnel effect. They're driving along, scanning the darkness ahead, and then all of a sudden, you can see it on the dashcam footage. A pair of headlights appears way off in the distance. And then, in a flash, that car comes bombing down the road right at them. Both cars slam on their brakes, and you can hear the loud screeching of tires on the pavement in the dashcam audio. The car in front of them comes to a full stop. Shaw stops too, but then he inches the BMW forward just a little bit more before stopping completely. Now the two cars are facing each other, maybe only 10 or 15 feet apart. It's important to remember that Shaw and Andrew's car was unmarked, and they had intentionally kept their blue police lights off as they drove up Admore Lane. They didn't want the suspects to see the flashing lights from a distance and have time to turn around and escape. So now, here they are, face to face in the dark. Andrew and Shaw are looking at the vehicle. They can see that it's a gray sedan, which matches the description of the car they're looking for. And behind the gray sedan, they can see what looks like a quad bike being towed. This is it. This is the car. There's no doubt in their minds. Shaw immediately flips on the blue emergency lights. Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, throws his door open and starts yelling at the occupants of the other car, ordering them to stay where they are. But the men in the gray car don't listen. They know they've been caught. There's a police car blocking their only way out. Their reaction is pure panic. Suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of the gray car leaps out of his door. He runs around to the back of their car and unhooks the quad bike. At the same time, the driver of the gray car, without even waiting for the third man to get back inside, just floors it. He tries to drive forward, going onto the left side of Shaw and Andrew's car, basically trying to squeeze past them even though there's nowhere to go but a deep ditch on the side of the road. But these guys are desperate. They're willing to do anything to get away. So the gray car lurches down into this ditch. It happens so fast that Andrew and Shaw can't do anything to stop it. At the same time, the third masked man, realizing he's about to be left behind, starts running around the right side of the police car, trying to circle around it the other way. And then, amazingly, just as this third man makes it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow manages to claw its way out of the ditch and get back onto the paved road. It starts speeding away from Shaw and Andrew. As it's driving away, the third man is just running down the road on foot, chasing after his own getaway car. Andrew sees this as an opportunity. He might be able to grab this third suspect who's out on foot, so he jumps out of the police car, turns, and starts sprinting down the road after them. Shaw is stuck. The road is too narrow for him to do a U-turn and drive after them. The only thing he can do is put the car in reverse, look over his shoulder, and start driving backwards down the road, trying to keep up. As Shaw is reversing, he can see the whole scene playing out through his rear window. He sees Andrew chasing the third masked man, who is in turn chasing the gray car. He's watching all of this unfold, and then something totally strange, something that seems to defy logic, happens. The third masked man suddenly leaps, as if he's trying to jump into the open window of the moving car. At the exact same moment, Andrew, who has closed the distance, kind of lunges forward to try and grab the man. And then, just as suddenly as it all happened, both men just vanish. They're gone. And the gray car just keeps driving and disappears into the darkness. Shaw is watching this, and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where did the third guy go? What just happened? But he's still in reverse, he can't stop, so he just keeps driving backwards, his eyes scanning the empty road behind him. Finally, he reaches a spot in the road that's just wide enough for him to turn the car around. As he's maneuvering the vehicle, you can hear a call come over the dispatch radio. Someone is asking Shaw for a status update, asking what's going on. All Shaw can say is, my partner Andrew has gotten out of the vehicle and I've lost him. I don't know where he is. After Shaw finally gets the car turned around, he starts driving forward back down the same creepy dark road. But now, there's nothing. It's eerily quiet. Andrew is nowhere to be found. The suspect's car is gone. The third masked man is gone. There's no one. Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that around the next bend, he's going to see his partner running on the side of the road, or maybe find him walking back towards him. But he doesn't see anything. As he was driving, what Shaw didn't realize at first was that there were things on the road, small things that belonged to Andrew. He didn't see them in the dark, but the dashcam footage would later reveal an awful trail. First, there was his wallet, lying on the asphalt. Then, a little further down, his police badge. Then, his driver's license and other ID cards. Then, one of his gloves. Then, a piece of black plastic that looked like it had been ripped off of Andrew's tactical vest. A little farther down the road, as Shaw is still driving and scanning the darkness, he does notice something in his headlights. He stops the vehicle and gets out. The air is still and silent on this pitch-black road. He walks up to the object and sees that it's Andrew's stab vest, the protective vest he wore over his chest. He picks it up, walks back to his car, and puts it in the passenger seat where Andrew had just been sitting. At this point, you can hear over the radio, people are still asking Shaw, what's going on? And you can hear the panic rising in Shaw's voice as he reports back, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road. He can't make any sense of it. He has no idea why it would be there. And dispatch doesn't know what to make of it either. So Shaw just gets back in the car and continues driving down that dark road, his mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, at the end of Admore Lane, where it connects back with the main road, the A4, two other Thames Valley police cars had arrived. They had gone to that intersection specifically to cut off the gray car as it fled. They were sitting there, waiting, and looking up Admore Lane when they saw headlights bombing towards them. It was the gray car. It came speeding out onto the A4, made a hard, screeching turn, and took off. One of the two police cars immediately took off in pursuit, chasing the gray car down the A4. But the other police car stayed right where it was. Because, unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It turns out, when Shaw had first put the BMW in reverse and was watching the scene through his back window, what he saw was real. The third masked man had jumped towards the moving car, and he had successfully gotten inside. As for Andrew, the reason he suddenly vanished is truly horrific. The three masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and two 17-year-olds, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All three of them had extensive criminal records, even at their young age. They proudly called themselves career thieves, which basically just meant they spent their days and nights stealing from other people. That night, they had gone out with the specific intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's not clear how they knew he had one, but they definitely came prepared. They knew they would have to get onto his property and tow the bike away very quickly before the homeowner had a chance to react. To do this, they had attached a long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically a big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. When they pulled onto the man's property, they had backed their car up to the quad bike, looped that strap of rope over its handlebars, and then all three of them piled back into the car and sped off, dragging the bike behind them. But when they came face to face with Andrew and Shaw on Admore Lane, they panicked. The third man, Jesse Cole, was the one who hopped out of the car. He ran around to the back and unhooked the loop of rope from the quad bike, ditching it on the side of the road. This would make it easier for the gray car to make its getaway. Once the rope was free, the driver, Henry Long, took off without waiting for Jesse. So Jesse ran around the police car, caught up to the side of their now moving car, and leaped through the window. As soon as he was inside and Henry knew his friends were all back in the car, Henry hit the gas and accelerated hard. And standing there in the middle of all that chaos with both of his feet planted squarely inside of that loop of rope that was now dangling off the back of the gray car was Police Constable Andrew Harper. When the car suddenly accelerated, Andrew was violently swept off his feet. The rope cinched around his ankles and his legs. His head came back and smashed hard against the ground. and then he was dragged. He was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down the entire length of Ardmore Lane. He was dragged for over a mile, whipping violently from side to side. He wasn't just being dragged along the ground, he was smashing into trees, into fence posts, into shrubs, anything and everything that lined that narrow country road. His body was being destroyed. It was only after they had dragged him for that entire mile that they finally reached the end of the road. When they pulled off Ardmore Lane and made that hard turn onto the A4, the centrifugal force of the turn swung Andrew's body around one last time. He smashed into a curb, which finally dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into the middle of the road into oncoming traffic. At that exact moment, one of the two police cars that had been waiting there took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the officers in the other car, they saw Andrew. They saw him as he was thrown from the back of the speeding car and launched onto the A4. Initially, they actually thought the suspects were dragging a dead deer behind them. That's what it looked like from a distance, just a bloody, mangled carcass dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they realized with absolute horror that it was their colleague. It was Andrew. They immediately tried to save his life, performing CPR, doing everything they could. But Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been torn apart. Andrew Harper died at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly decided to respond to that call, despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about an hour after Andrew died. A police helicopter had spotted their car hidden amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew's body was found. During their trial, the three teenagers claimed that they had no idea that Andrew was attached to their tow rope as they sped down Ardmore Lane. They insisted it was a tragic accident. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They went out and meticulously recreated the exact scene that had played out. They used the same model of car, the same kind of tow rope, and a lifelike crash test dummy that was the same size and weight as Andrew Harper, 6'5" and around 200 pounds. They strapped the dummy to the back of the car in the same way Andrew had been caught, and they drove that same 1-mile stretch of road. The experts who conducted this recreation all said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car. As soon as the dummy would start to shift from one side to the other, it would tug and pull violently on the little gray car. Handling the car would have been a complete nightmare for the driver. Not only that, but the sound of Andrew's body grinding against the asphalt and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. The prosecution argued that there was absolutely no way that the three teens inside that car would not have known that a person was being dragged behind them. The prosecution also presented evidence that all along Ardmore Lane, they had found Andrew's blood on both sides of the road, high up in bushes and on trees. This indicated that the driver, Henry Long, must have been swerving violently from side to side as he drove. And according to the prosecution, the most likely reason for that was that he was trying to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they were sorry for what happened. They showed absolutely no remorse. When the final verdict was read in court, they were found not guilty of murder. They were, however, found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. For them, this was a huge victory because the sentences for manslaughter were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, the three teens were seen punching the air, cheering, and laughing in the courtroom. They were making a complete spectacle of themselves. After being led out of the courthouse with Andrew Harper's devastated family watching them, they were smirking and smiling for the news cameras, waving, and just treating the entire tragedy like it was one big joke. To this day, none of them have ever apologized or expressed any regret for what they did. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, have since come out publicly and said they plan to write a book about the crime, about killing Andrew Harper. And there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It seems it's being written as an opportunity to make money from their crime. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, was completely devastated. She was shattered not only by the loss of her husband of just 4 weeks, but also by what she saw as a total injustice. The fact that these three had not been convicted of murder was something she could not accept. She channeled her grief into action. She went on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law in the UK, which she called Harper's Law. This law would mandate an automatic life sentence for any criminal who killed an emergency worker while in the process of committing a crime. The law would not differentiate between manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker during a crime, you would go to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was officially passed. However, the new law will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers, as laws cannot be applied retroactively. Henry Long was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The other two, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole, were each sentenced to 13 years. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the exact same age that Andrew was when they took his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. This is a story that has fascinated people for decades. It's one of those cases that, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't seem to make sense. In 1979, the New York Times called it one of the Western world's most convincing cases of reincarnation. Now, a lot of stories about past lives are hard to verify. There's usually no real proof you can point to today. But this one is different. This is the story of a woman named Dorothy Eady, who later became known as Om Seti. And her life story and the things she claimed to remember from a past life led to real, verifiable, modern-day discoveries in Egypt. Things that professional Egyptologists and historians just couldn't explain. For decades, they tried to prove she was a fraud, that she was lying. And they never could. She knew things she just shouldn't have known. Things that make you stop and wonder, what if she was telling the truth? Our story begins in London in 1904. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family. She was an only child, and her parents absolutely adored her. Life was normal, quiet, and happy for the first 3 years. And then, one day, everything changed. Little 3-year-old Dorothy was playing in her home when she took a terrible fall down a flight of stairs. She was knocked completely unconscious. Her parents were frantic. They called for the family doctor, who rushed over to the house. He examined Dorothy, and after a few moments, he had to deliver the worst news imaginable. He turned to her parents and told them their daughter was dead. The next hour was just a blur of grief for her parents. The doctor was there, trying to console them, talking about what needed to happen next. They were in a state of total shock. But then, about an hour after the doctor had pronounced her dead, they heard something, a sound coming from Dorothy's bedroom. They went to check, and they could not believe their eyes. There was Dorothy, sitting up on her bed, playing as if nothing had happened. They rushed in, the doctor right behind them, and they were all just speechless. Dorothy seemed perfectly fine. Her parents, in their confusion and relief, turned on the doctor. They were furious, yelling at him for pronouncing her dead when she was clearly alive. But the doctor was adamant. He swore she had been gone. He had checked for a pulse, for breath. There was nothing. He had no medical explanation for what had just happened. In the days and weeks after the accident, Dorothy's parents noticed some changes. The biggest one was her voice. She started speaking with a strange accent, one they couldn't place at all. They took her to doctors and specialists who suggested she might be suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome. It's a real medical condition that can happen after a significant head injury, and it basically alters a person's speech patterns. To someone who doesn't know, it can sound like they suddenly have a foreign accent. But that wasn't the only strange thing. Dorothy also started talking about a recurring dream. She told her parents that every night she would dream of a huge building with massive pillars. And right next to this building was the most beautiful garden she had ever seen. She would describe the flowers, the trees, the feeling of peace she had when she was there. It was like an oasis. She loved this garden more than anything. But in the dream, she didn't know where it was. And being just 3 or 4 years old, she had a hard time articulating exactly what she was seeing. All she knew was that she loved this place in her dreams, and she talked about it constantly. It got to the point where her mother would often find her crying in her bed, either before going to sleep or right after waking up. When her mother asked what was wrong, Dorothy would say she wanted to go home. Her mother would try to reassure her, saying, "But honey, you are home." And Dorothy would shake her head and insist, "No, I'm not. My home is there, in the garden." She was completely convinced that the place in her dreams was her real home, and nothing her parents said could change her mind. A little while later, when Dorothy was still very young, her parents decided to take her on a trip to the British Museum. The museum had a large exhibit on ancient Egypt. As they walked in, Dorothy spotted the Egyptian section from across the room. Her eyes went wide. She saw the towering statues of pharaohs, the pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and then she just took off. She sprinted away from her parents, running straight into the exhibit. She ran up to the statues, these ancient stone figures, and started kissing their feet. She was sobbing, completely overcome with emotion, and yelling out loud, "I'm home! I'm home! I'm with my people!" This tiny little girl was having this huge emotional revelation right there in the middle of the museum. Her parents were mortified. People were staring, wondering what on earth was wrong with their child. They eventually managed to calm her down and get her to leave, but something had clicked into place for Dorothy. From that day forward, she knew. The beautiful garden from her dreams, the place she longed for, was in Egypt. Her newfound obsession with ancient Egypt started to cause problems. Her family was very devoutly Catholic, and they sent her to Sunday school. But Dorothy would constantly compare the teachings of Catholicism with what she knew about ancient Egyptian religions. This did not go over well. Eventually, the church told her she couldn't come to Sunday school anymore. Then, she was expelled from her Catholic school. The reason was that she refused to sing certain hymns, specifically ones that she felt were disrespectful to the ancient Egyptians. She was even barred from attending Sunday Mass. By the age of 6, Dorothy, who was already a good reader and writer in English, became fascinated with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The moment she saw them, she said they felt familiar, but it was like a language she had forgotten how to read. When she was 7 years old, she was looking through a book one day when she saw a picture. It was a photograph of the Temple of Seti I, which is in a place called Abydos, Egypt. The picture showed the Grand Temple, and next to it were the crumbling remains of what looked like it might have once been a garden. As soon as Dorothy saw it, she pointed and said, "That's it. That's my home." She was absolutely certain. That temple in Abydos was where she was from. She looked closer at the picture, at the broken, tattered remains next to the temple walls. "That's the garden," she said. "But where are all the trees? Why does it look like this?" She couldn't understand that thousands of years had passed. In her mind, she was seeing her home, but it was ruined. The textbook also had a picture of the pharaoh the temple was named after, Seti I. When she saw the image of his very well-preserved mummy, she was once again overcome with emotion. She said she had known him. She remembered him personally. This incredible knowledge didn't go unnoticed. At age 10, she caught the attention of a world-renowned Egyptologist named E.A. Wallace Budge. He was so impressed by her passion and her strange familiarity with the subject that he offered to personally teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics. She picked it up almost instantly, as if she were just remembering something she already knew. As she got older, the dreams continued. But starting around age 14, a new one began. It was a nightmare. In this nightmare, she was trapped in a dark underground room. A high priest was there, interrogating her, demanding she answer his questions. When she refused, he had her beaten. This dream would haunt her for years. Fast forward to when Dorothy, now called Edie, was 27. She met an Egyptian man, and they fell in love. But it's also very likely she saw the marriage as a way to finally get to Egypt. She wanted to secure Egyptian residency. As soon as they were married, they moved. The moment their boat landed in Egypt, Edie was overwhelmed. She got down on her hands and knees, kissed the ground, and cried, saying over and over again, "I'm home. I'm finally home." She and her husband soon had a son, and in a move that surprised no one who knew her, they named him Seti. Once she was living in Egypt, Edie's experiences became even more intense. She claimed she started receiving nightly visits from a spiritual entity she called Hora. She believed Hora was the spirit of the pharaoh, Seti I. For about a year, these visits would happen almost every night. Her husband would wake up in the middle of the night to find her in a trance-like state. She would be sitting up, her eyes glazed over, frantically writing in a notebook, but she wasn't writing in English. She was writing page after page of perfect, intricate hieroglyphics. Her husband said he couldn't snap her out of it. It was like she was possessed, just writing and writing. Edie later explained that Hora was dictating her life story to her, the story of who she used to be. Over the course of that year, she filled over 70 pages with this story, all written in hieroglyphics. And the story went like this. Before she was Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Bentrashite, which means harp of joy. She had lived 3,000 years earlier during the reign of Pharaoh Seti I. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a simple vegetable seller. Her mother died when Bentrashite was only 3 years old. Her father, unable to care for her on his own, placed her in the temple at Kom el Sultan, which was near Abydos. She was raised in the temple and eventually became a priestess. When she turned 12, she was given a choice. She could either leave the temple and go out into the world on her own, or she could stay and become a consecrated virgin, dedicating her life to the gods. Bentrashit chose to stay and took the vows. But a few years later, she met Pharaoh Seti I. They fell in love and began a secret relationship. Soon after, she discovered she was pregnant. For a consecrated virgin priestess, this was a catastrophic transgression. The high priest of the temple found out and interrogated her fiercely, demanding to know the name of the father. This interrogation, she realized, was the scene from her recurring nightmare. He had her beaten when she refused to name Seti. Bentrashit knew that if the truth came out, it would cause a massive public scandal for the pharaoh, the man she loved. Unwilling to let that happen, she took her own life. This entire experience, the nightly trances, the obsessive writing of hieroglyphics, the bizarre story of a past life, was all too much for Edie's husband. He grew more and more disturbed by her behavior. In 1936, he filed for divorce. After the divorce, Dorothy and her young son Seti moved to a town near the Giza pyramids. It was around this time that she stopped going by Dorothy Edie. She adopted a new name, Seti, which in Arabic means Mother of Seti. She was fully embracing her new identity, one that was deeply connected to ancient Egypt. She soon took a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, beginning a long and surprisingly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti dedicated her life to her work. She researched and wrote and drew, becoming an expert. Her primary focus, of course, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. She learned everything there was to know about its history, its architecture, and the people who lived and worked there 3,000 years ago. It was, after all, the place she believed had been her home. But incredibly, for all those years, she never actually went there. It wasn't until 1952, when she was almost 50 years old, that she finally got the chance to set foot in Abydos. A job transfer came up, and she jumped at the opportunity. In fact, she was so desperate to go that she even took a significant pay cut to get the position. The moment she walked into the temple grounds, she felt a profound sense of familiarity. The first thing she said was, "It's as if I've lived here before." She quickly set up an office for herself in one of the temple's rooms and spent nearly all of her time there, working and just being in the space. She even developed a strange friendship with a wild cobra that lived on the grounds. She would feed it every day, and the snake would just hang out with her. Nobody could make sense of it. Rumors flew around about this eccentric Englishwoman, but her contributions to Egyptology were so significant and so valuable that she earned the deep respect of her colleagues, even if they thought her personal beliefs were strange. But of all her accomplishments, Seti is most famous for what happened shortly after she arrived at the temple. She had been dreaming of that beautiful garden her entire life. She walked around the crumbling exterior of the temple, and then she pointed to a specific spot. She told the chief inspector of antiquities that if they dug right there, they would find the temple garden. The archaeologists were skeptical. There were no records, no texts, nothing to suggest a garden had ever been in that location. But Seti was so certain. She didn't just point to the spot, she described the entire layout. She told them where the pathways would be, what kinds of trees they would find, and where those trees were planted. To appease her, and probably to prove her wrong, they decided to dig. And they were stunned. They dug down, and there it was. A garden. Exactly where she said it would be. And as they excavated, they found that the layout, the root systems of the ancient trees, everything matched her descriptions perfectly. This was information she could not have possibly known. It wasn't written down anywhere. But that was just the beginning. She then told them to excavate on the north side of the temple. She said there was a secret, undiscovered tunnel that ran underneath the temple from that side. Again, the archaeologists were doubtful. But again, they dug. And sure enough, there was the tunnel. It was a major discovery, and only she knew about it. Her uncanny knowledge didn't stop at the temple. She also pointed researchers to a specific unexplored area in the Valley of the Kings, a famous burial ground for pharaohs. She told them they would find a long-forgotten tomb there. They searched where she indicated, and they found a tomb that had never been discovered before. Time and time again, she provided information that led to incredible finds. The other Egyptologists, the scientists and academics, they didn't want to believe her story about reincarnation. They wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a strange woman, maybe an elaborate and clever hoax. But they were faced with a problem they couldn't solve. They couldn't deny the results. She possessed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the Temple of Seti I and the surrounding area during the exact time frame she claimed to have lived there as Bentreshit. They simply could not explain how she knew what she knew. Right before she passed away at the age of 81, Seti shared one final secret. She said that deep beneath the Temple of Seti I, there is a secret chamber. And inside that chamber, there is another secret, a library of records or a hidden tomb, something of incredible importance. But she passed away before she could give more specific directions. No one knows exactly where to begin looking. And so, without Seti to guide them, her final secret may be one that is lost to time. Her story leaves us with so many questions. Without any logical, rational explanation for her knowledge, for her ability to pinpoint lost gardens and secret tunnels, even skeptics are left to wonder. Was she a brilliant hoaxer who somehow found lost information that no one else could? Or was Dorothy Eady, the little girl from London, truly the reincarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the far northern tip of Maine, right where the state touches the Canadian border, there's a small rural town called Van Buren. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. The population hovers around 2,000 people, and most of them have lived in Maine their entire lives. These are rugged, competent folks used to harsh winters and a quiet way of life. Unless you have a reason to be in Van Buren, like visiting family or passing through, you've probably never heard of it. It's not a place that makes headlines. But that all changed in 2019. The town found itself in the international spotlight, and it was all because of one man, a man named Ronald Sear. Ronald's story begins long before that, back in the 1950s. As a young man, he did what many of his generation did. He joined the Air Force and he served his country during the Korean War. When his time in the military was over, he didn't look for a new life in some big city. He came straight back home to Van Buren, Maine. He settled into a modest 2-story house near the center of town. For a little while, he just kind of floated. He didn't have a specific direction or a clear career path, but Ronald was always good with his hands. He loved building things, tinkering, figuring out how things worked. This natural skill and passion eventually led him to start his own business. It was a small but successful company selling tools, and he ran it right out of the shed on his property. It was his domain, his workshop, and his livelihood all in one. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear was now 65 years old. He was still living in that same house near town, but now he was living alone. And he was still running his tool-selling business from his shed. For Ronald, this life was enough. He was content. He had his routine, his work, his independence. He was happy. But that year, a crisis began to unfold. A small crack in his peaceful existence that would widen until it consumed everything. It started on a bright, sunny summer morning. Ronald left his house, walked the familiar path across his yard to his shed, and went inside. The moment he stepped through the door, he knew something was wrong. Inside the shed, Ronald kept a series of bins. These bins were filled with all the different tools he sold to his customers. He was in that shed every single day, either selling tools to a local contractor or just working on one of his own projects. Because of this, he had an almost photographic memory of his inventory. He knew exactly how full each of those bins should be. Anytime a bin started to get low, he would place an order for more stock. He was meticulous about it. He had been doing this for decades, and keeping his inventory full was second nature. So, on this particular morning, he walked in, and his eyes immediately went to a couple of the bins. They looked lower than he remembered. They were definitely not as full as they should have been. His first thought was simple. He must have made a mistake. Did I forget to order more supplies? Did I just let the stock run down without noticing? But the idea didn't sit right with him. He thought to himself, no, that's not possible. I am always on top of my inventory. It's the core of my business. It has to be something else. Maybe I took some tools into the house for a repair and just left them on the kitchen counter. Or maybe they're in the back of my truck. He was sure there was a perfectly logical explanation. So Ronald left the shed and began to search his property. He checked his house from top to bottom. He went through his truck, looking under the seats, in the glove compartment. But the missing tools were nowhere to be found. Now, a little more concerned, he started making phone calls. He called his family members. He called the few close friends he had. He asked each of them the same question. Did you happen to come by and borrow some tools from the shed? Do you know anything about this? But every single person he spoke to gave him the same answer. No, Ronald, I have no idea what you're talking about. By the afternoon, Ronald found himself back inside his shed, standing among his bins, a feeling of unease settling deep in his stomach. He looked around, and only one explanation remained in his mind. Have I been robbed? It seemed impossible in a town like Van Buren, but what else could it be? He drove down to the local police station and explained what had happened. He told the officers about his business, his meticulous inventory, and the tools that had vanished without a trace. But the police reaction was not what he had hoped for. They were polite but dismissive. They basically suggested that he, a man who had run this business for decades, had simply miscounted. They told him the tools were probably still on his property somewhere, that he'd just misplaced them, and they were bound to turn up. An officer told him, look, Ronald, go back and do a really thorough search of your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you find some actual proof that someone stole from you, like a broken lock or a witness, then you can come back to us. Ronald left the station feeling completely annoyed and invalidated. He wanted them to take this seriously. He knew his property, he knew his inventory, and he knew something was wrong, but he could tell they weren't going to do anything. He drove back home, his mind racing. He went inside, sat down at his computer, and started researching. He typed in phrases like how to protect your home from theft and DIY home security. He scrolled through forums and articles looking for what other homeowners did when they felt vulnerable. That's when he came across an idea that he really liked: tripwires. The concept was simple. You take a thin, strong wire and you stretch it taut, very low to the ground, all around the perimeter of your property. You anchor it on both sides. Then, along the wire, you hang little bells. In theory, an intruder walking onto your property in the dark wouldn't see the wire. They would kick it, the wire would shake, and the bells would ring, alerting the homeowner that someone was there. Ronald thought it was a brilliant, old-school solution. He went out and bought the supplies he needed. He spent the rest of the day carefully setting up these tripwires all around his property, making sure they were hidden but effective. He felt a sense of relief, a feeling that he was taking back control. But over the next several days, the tripwires remained silent. None of the bells ever rang. And yet, more tools continued to go missing from his shed. This was happening even though he was now making sure to lock the shed every single night. Ronald's anxiety grew. He started thinking, whoever is doing this, they're watching me. They must have seen me set up the tripwires. They know where they are, and they're stepping right over them. They must be sneaking into the shed during the day at the exact moment I have the doors unlocked for a customer, or when I step into the house for a moment. This isn't just some kid. This is a professional thief. As Ronald obsessed over this idea of a master thief who was targeting him, a new and much deeper fear began to take hold. If he couldn't stop this person from getting into his locked shed, from outsmarting his tripwires, then how could he possibly protect himself? How could he stop them from breaking into his house? Inside his home were all of his other valuables, his cash, things that couldn't be replaced. The thought terrified him. He felt exposed, a target in his own home. He decided he had no choice but to escalate his defenses. He had to turn his home into a fortress. He went back to his computer and began Googling more extreme ways to protect a property. After discovering a number of highly effective and highly dangerous techniques, he got to work. He began building a series of complex home defense systems. He was a skilled handyman, and he put all of his knowledge and effort into this project. He set up these various systems all around his property, both inside and outside his house. And after all of his new do-it-yourself security measures were in place, something remarkable happened. The theft of his tools stopped completely. In Ronald's mind, this was all the validation he needed. His defense system had worked. He had successfully outsmarted the thief and protected his home. But this victory would not be the end of his troubles. It was only the beginning of the end. Fast forward to Thanksgiving of that year, November 28th, the Van Buren Police Department received a frantic phone call. The man on the other end of the line was Ronald Sear. He was completely hysterical, his words tumbling out in a panic. He wasn't making much sense. The dispatcher tried to calm him down, tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was a desperate plea for police to come to his house immediately. The police hung up and immediately dispatched a car. They remembered Ronald from the summer. They knew he had been dealing with a potential thief. Their immediate thought was that maybe he had finally caught the person red-handed. Maybe there was a confrontation, a fight, happening at his house right now. The police raced over to Ronald's house, their sirens silent so as not to spook a potential suspect. They pulled into his driveway, and at first glance, everything looked normal. Ronald's truck was parked where it always was. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or a disturbance. But then they noticed something unsettling. The front door to Ronald's house was wide open. The officers parked their cars, got out, and ran up onto the front porch. They stood in front of the open doorway and looked down. On the floor, there was a very obvious trail of blood. It started right there at the entrance and led straight back down a hallway, which then looped around to the left and disappeared from sight. Right away, the officers started yelling into the house. "Ronald? Ronald, are you okay? What's going on?" From deep inside the house, they heard a sound. It was a guttural, pained noise, and it sounded like it came from Ronald. This immediately confirmed their fears. Ronald had been hurt, and he was likely the one who had left the blood trail. The police drew their weapons and cautiously entered the house. They had no idea what they were walking into. They didn't know if an intruder was still inside, armed, and waiting for them. They moved slowly down the hall, their eyes scanning every corner, following the grim trail of blood. They rounded the corner where the hallway turned, and at the end of the trail, they found him. Ronald was sitting on the floor in his kitchen, his back slumped against some cabinets. He was clutching his midsection with both hands. He was covered in blood, and his face was completely pale. The officers immediately called for backup and for an ambulance. Then, as a security measure, one officer stayed with Ronald, while the other quickly cleared the rest of the first floor, making sure there was no one else in the house. The first floor was empty. They went upstairs, peeking into the rooms. The second floor was empty too. They rushed back down to Ronald, who was still just sitting there, barely conscious. They began administering first aid, trying to apply pressure to his wound. They tried to get him to explain what had happened, to tell them who did this to him. But Ronald was clearly in shock. He was in a daze, his eyes unfocused. He wasn't making any sense. Just a couple of minutes later, paramedics arrived. But by the time they got to him, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. As Ronald was being wheeled out of the house on a stretcher, the responding officers and the backup who had now arrived decided to do a more thorough search of the house. They needed to find some clue, any clue, as to what had happened here. They started in the kitchen where they had found him, looking for a weapon, a sign of a struggle, anything that stood out. But there was nothing. They moved from the kitchen towards the living room at the front of the house. As they walked into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Everybody stop where you are! Don't move!" It turns out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property. This included inside of his house, and some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer who had yelled for everyone to stop had just spotted one of them. He was looking up and saw a handgun anchored securely to the ceiling, aimed directly at the front door. A thin string was attached to the gun's trigger. That same string was then stretched across the room and attached to the doorknob of the front door. The mechanism was horribly simple. If this trap was active and a person opened the front door from the outside, the movement of the door would pull the string, which would pull the trigger, causing the gun to shoot whoever was standing in the doorway. It was a deadly, homemade security device. Clearly, Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap armed. When he had come home or opened his own front door for some reason, he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself in the stomach. After the officer pointed out the gun on the ceiling, everyone else started looking up. They began scanning the doorways and ceilings, and with a growing sense of horror, they realized there were other traps. In other doorways, just from where they were standing, they could see the barrels of more guns pointing down, clearly part of similar booby traps. In their haste to get inside and find Ronald, they had run right past them, completely oblivious to the danger they were in. It was a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald was rushed to the hospital that night, but his wound was too severe. He passed away from his injury. His death was officially ruled an accident. And to this day, no one knows for sure if he really was dealing with a professional thief who was systematically stealing his tools, or if the thief was just a figment of his imagination, a product of loneliness and fear that drove him to turn his own home into a death trap. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, her family was always struggling. They barely had enough money to get by, and life was a constant challenge. Then, by the time Mary turned 21, a double tragedy struck. Both of her parents passed away, leaving her completely alone in the world with nothing to her name. After their deaths, Mary's life felt unanchored. She bounced around Houston, moving from one low-paying job to the next, just trying to stay afloat. Eventually, she met a man and fell madly in love. They got married, and for a while, it seemed like her life was finally turning around. But unfortunately, that marriage ended in divorce, leaving her heartbroken. After she managed to pick up the pieces, she met another man. Once again, she fell in love, and they too got married. It seemed like a second chance at happiness. But just like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was devastated by yet another heartbreak. She came to a quiet, sad conclusion. She decided that marriage just wasn't for her. She accepted that she probably wasn't going to have a family of her own. But she didn't let this realization crush her. Instead, she did something remarkable. She embraced her life as a loner. She found a new kind of contentment in her own company. Fast forward to the year 2015. Mary was now 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood that was rapidly changing. Over the past several decades, the area had begun to grow and gentrify. New modern apartment complexes were being built all the time, swallowing up the older, smaller houses. In fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary directly. They offered to buy her house so they could tear it down and build over her land. But Mary refused. It didn't matter how much money they offered her. She loved her little house, and she had no intention of selling it. So her house became an island, the only single-family home left on a long stretch of land, now dominated by large apartment buildings. Mary kind of liked it that way. In her diary, she wrote that her little bungalow was like her castle, and all the towering apartment buildings around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She had some living family, but she had very little, if any, contact with them. And she didn't really have any friends. There was one exception, a woman who owned an arts and crafts shop in town. Mary would periodically go into town and visit the shop just to say hello and have a brief conversation. But despite all of this, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats. She absolutely loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat wandering through her neighborhood, Mary would put out food and water for it. She would patiently try to coax the cat to come closer, to come into her house, and when it finally did, she would work to win the cat's trust. Once she did, she would give it a permanent place to live. She would feed it and take care of it as if it were her own child. Before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. These cats became her family. They were her best friends. And because of them, she rarely, if ever, left the house. She mostly just stayed inside with them in her own little world, content and surrounded by the creatures she loved. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property. They glanced over at her house and saw a stack of mail had piled up on her front porch. It was a clear sign that Mary hadn't opened her front door to get her mail in several days. The neighbor also noticed that while Mary's yard did tend to get a little overgrown from time to time, it now looked exceptionally wild. The grass was high, the trees were untrimmed. It looked like no one was even trying to take care of it. A feeling of concern washed over the neighbor. Maybe something had happened to Mary. So, the neighbor opened the gate to her fence, walked across the unkempt yard, and went up onto the porch. They knocked firmly on the front door, but there was only silence from inside. The neighbor leaned over and tried to peer through the window that was just to the left of the door, hoping to see something, anything. But there was a curtain drawn across the window, blocking the view. The neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, louder this time, but again, they were met with total silence. After standing there for another minute, unsure what to do, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house. They thought maybe they could look in one of the side windows, but when they got there, those windows were covered with curtains too. The neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there on the sidewalk, looking at the quiet, still house. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was wrong. Someone needed to make sure Mary was really okay. Someone needed to get inside that house. So, the neighbor pulled out their phone and called the Houston police, explaining the situation and their concerns. A few minutes later, a police car arrived. The officers walked right up onto Mary's porch, just as the neighbor had done. They knocked on her door. Silence. After that, the police talked to another neighbor who surprisingly had a spare key that Mary had given them a long time ago for emergencies. The police took the key and went back to Mary's front door. They put the key in the lock, turned it, and the door clicked open. The moment they pushed the door open, they were hit with a horrible, overwhelming smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open and cautiously stepped inside. They yelled out Mary's name, but it was silent. Then, before the police even began to walk around and look for her, they looked off to their left and to their right, and they saw a truly tragic sight. There were dead cats all over the ground, in every room they could see from the doorway. The Houston police had seen situations like this before. They knew the likely scenario. Someone who lives alone, with no one regularly checking on them, passes away unexpectedly. And when they die, all of their pets are trapped inside the house. With no one to feed them or give them water, they eventually pass away too. So at this point, the police were fully expecting to find Mary's body somewhere in the house. They began to walk through the home, room by room, searching for her. But after searching the entire house from top to bottom, checking every closet, every corner, they could not find Mary anywhere. Confused, the police left Mary's house. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the police cars. The officers spoke to a couple of the neighbors and asked them what they knew. Did she say anything about going somewhere? Did you see her leave at any point? The consensus among everyone they spoke to was the same. Mary kept to herself. She didn't travel. She never went anywhere. She just stayed in her house with her cats. It was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned her home, and especially abandoned her cats, because she loved them so much. The police were now completely baffled. She had to be in the house somewhere. So they called for a few more officers to come to the property. The whole group went back inside Mary's house and conducted a second, much more thorough search. They really looked for Mary this time, thinking that maybe she had collapsed in a closet and her body was hidden behind some clothes, or that she was somehow concealed somewhere in the house. They really tore the place apart, looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. She was gone. After they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police managed to track down and contact some of Mary's extended family. They asked them the same question. Did Mary say anything about taking a trip? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? But her family all said the same thing. We don't really talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have absolutely no idea. For a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around the city, but they found no leads, no trace of her at all. Eventually, the search wound down, and her case went cold. They reached out to Mary's family one last time and told them, if you hear anything at all about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, with no one making the mortgage payments, Mary's house went into foreclosure. The bank put the house up for auction, and a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought it quickly. He had the house cleaned out, made some minor repairs, and then put it on the market to be rented out. For the next couple of years, several different tenants lived in Mary's old house. None of them ever stayed for very long. Then, in March of 2017, the property was vacant again. A young couple reached out to the landlord. They said they were looking to rent and were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled to have long-term tenants. He sent over a lease, they signed it, and the property was theirs. Once the couple had officially rented the house, the husband decided to go over on his own. He wanted to walk around the property and get a sense of the space to see what they would need to buy in terms of furniture. So, the husband arrived at the property. He went in the front door, walked around the first floor, and then at some point he decided he wanted to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they had. He found the trapdoor in the ceiling of a hallway. He grabbed the string that was hanging down and he pulled it, revealing a folded-up ladder. He flipped down the lower piece of the ladder, set it on the ground, and then began to climb up. Once his head was in the attic, he stayed on the ladder for a moment, just scanning the space. He saw that there really wasn't much up there. There were a couple of old metal cages that looked like they might have been for pets, but mostly it was just dirty and dark. It was clear that no one had really come up here in a long time. He assumed that the other tenants just hadn't used it for storage. The husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed something odd. Off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof began to pitch down towards the floor, he saw that one of the floorboards was popped up. It didn't look right. He stared at it, looking around at the rest of the attic floor. All the other floorboards were perfectly flat and uniform, but that one was really jacked up, sticking out at an angle. He was curious. So he climbed the rest of the way up into the attic, stooped down to avoid the low ceiling, and walked over to this loose floorboard. When he was standing over it, he could see that the board had come loose from a hole in the floor that it was supposed to be covering. The hole itself was completely dark. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed the beam of light straight down into the hole. This hole wasn't a crawl space. It was basically just a gap, a void, between two of the interior walls on the first floor. And as he shined his light down into that dark, narrow gap, he saw them. At the bottom were the skeletal remains of the woman the Houston police had been looking for the past 2 years, Mary Cerruti. While no one can know for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed that back in early 2015, around the time she went missing, she had gone up into her attic. Perhaps her cats liked to go up there to sunbathe. On that side of the attic, there was a large window that let in a lot of light. So maybe she went up there to feed them or just to check on them. As she walked over to that side of the attic, she must have stepped on that one loose floorboard. It gave out from under her weight, and she fell through it like a trapdoor. She would have fallen down into that narrow gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was seriously hurt from the fall itself. But when she stood back up again in that tight, dark space, she would have realized very quickly the horror of her situation. There was nowhere for her to go. She couldn't go left or right, and she couldn't get back up into the attic. The opening was too far above her for her to reach. And there was no way for her to use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow she could barely even move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call for help. And even if she screamed, no one would have heard her. She was behind several layers of walls and insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one who was going to notice she was missing and come looking for her. She was totally, completely on her own. Trapped in that little space inside her own home, Mary likely spent her last couple of days screaming and desperately trying to find a way out. But nothing worked. And eventually, she passed away. And then, tragically, all of her beloved cats trapped inside the house without her did too. Her death was ruled an accident. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now, Daisy was pregnant. They were both incredibly excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Wimauma, a quiet, rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated from high school, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic. And he had the skills for it. From the time he was a toddler, he had been obsessed with cars. He would break apart his toy cars and then patiently put them back together again, figuring out how every little piece worked. As he got a little older, he started drawing these very intricate, detailed pictures of cars that he loved or his own designs for new cars. Then, when he was a teenager, he began tinkering with real cars until he finally saved up enough money to get a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck, and it was his pride and joy. He tricked it out with all these fancy lights, special rims, and a huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. He even gave it a nickname, Casper. It was thanks in part to this truck that Antonio, who was usually too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup. It was an event for other car enthusiasts where you could park your vehicle and walk around to see what other people had done to upgrade or enhance their own cars. While Antonio was there, walking around and admiring the other vehicles, he saw her. On the far side of the meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman. He found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, eventually looked up, caught his eye, and she smiled at him. And the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, the couple announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby. And then Antonio got yet another piece of good news. He had landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant. The plant was located in Apollo Beach, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of his parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to become an auto mechanic one day. But this job paid $12 an hour, which was nearly double what he was used to making. With this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to save up enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked for the company that this was actually a really easy job. He'd heard that pretty much all you did was roll around on golf carts all day, picking up trash. It sounded perfect. A A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck, Casper, to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous the place was. It was basically a huge factory that sat right up against the water. There were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of the factory with thick white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units inside the factory. Each of these units was comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. Here's how it worked. Coal is loaded into this huge boiler and it burns at the bottom. This creates steam. That steam travels up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, and that's what creates the electricity. The steam then just continues up the boiler and out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer, more modern power plants, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built back in the 1970s. They were older models, and they did not have a system to capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag. Slag is basically molten lava, the same kind of stuff that comes out of volcanoes. As this slag built up inside the boiler, it was designed to drain through a man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler. Right below that hole was a 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank. This red-hot slag would basically dump down into that water, which would cool it off instantly, turning it into these kind of glassy, hard rocks. These rocks would then settle at the bottom of the 30-foot cooling tank. At the very bottom of the tank was a grinding mechanism. This grinder would pull these hardened, cooled-off little boulders of slag into it, crush them up, and then spit them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. These chips would then get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So, after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, hopped out of his truck, and headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for him. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety procedures and training. When he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate his way around the inside of this huge factory, which was like a giant maze. He found out very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work. There were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout of the plant and also on what his job would actually entail. On Thursday, June 29th, just 4 days into his new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood. The next day, Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound. They were finally going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl, and he was incredibly excited about it. So Antonio came downstairs, grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek. He headed outside, got into his truck, and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store. She pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed she had a missed call from Antonio. He had left a voicemail. So she played the voicemail and put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work without any issues. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was just like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility in a golf cart and picked up trash. That was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, 2 fairly significant issues arose at the exact same time, both of them inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the molten slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump down into the water chamber. So, as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into the chamber. All of this molten slag was just building up on top of itself inside the boiler. At the same time, down in the water chamber, in a completely unconnected issue, the slag that had previously fallen into the water, cooled and settled at the bottom, had landed in such a way that it had actually blocked the grinding mechanism. So, none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. They needed to fix these two issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective and would have to be shut down. Now, the safe way to fix these two blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler completely. Then, once it was off and had time to cool, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself to break up the blockage over the man-sized hole. And you could send a team of workers into the water chamber after you drained it to manually chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. It costs a huge amount of money in lost revenue. So, the Tampa Electric Company decided to do things differently. They decided to just have their workers fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. At 4 p.m, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. The plan was this. They would empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2. Then, once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is a small access door on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that door up, giving them a direct line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber, right where the grinding mechanism was, where all those cooled slag rocks had piled up. They would then fire high-pressure water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to try and dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. After they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and then figure out how to deal with the blockage inside the boiler above. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked its employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on. And in the past, nothing bad had ever happened. So these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just a totally routine procedure. They probably thought they would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out that what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at that plant. Either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2. They began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just there to clean up any mess during and after the operation. So he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back from it, just standing and watching the other guys do their jobs. You need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and directly above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. There is coal actively burning inside of it. There is red-hot slag, basically lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These men were completely dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation began. The senior plant manager had the water chamber drained. Then, after it was empty, they opened the doghouse door. Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through the small door at the big slag rocks that were sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. It wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some slow progress. Antonio was likely just kind of getting bored, waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup happening yet. And then, as he was standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. So you have all this molten slag that's building up and building up, getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the immense weight of all that slag finally broke through the plug. Immediately, this created a massive opening where all this red-hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It fell into the empty cooling tank, rebounded off the back wall, and shot out of the open doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. In seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave of fire washing over them. And then, after the slag hit the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of what was basically lava, a molten pool that stretched 40 feet in every direction. Now, unlike trying to run in mud or deep water where you're just moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, your foot basically melts into it. With every single step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. So all of these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and literally catching on fire, likely tried to start running. But it was like their bodies were being slowly consumed by this slag feet first. Antonio tried to run, just like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere. He fell onto the slag, he was laying on his side, and as he was literally melting and burning to death, he reached into his pants pocket with his free hand. He pulled his phone out, and he called his mother. She didn't pick up, and so he left her a voicemail. And all he said was, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you can hear is the horrible hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.